We are so fortunate to have two highly acclaimed guests with us tonight. Brandon Taylor, known for the novels The Late Americans and Real Life, shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, is returning to the Center for Fiction stage to celebrate the release of his highly anticipated book, Minor Black Figures. His work takes a sharp look at representation within the art scene and the struggle to find creativity under scrutiny. And Brandon will be joined in conversation by Matthew Sitman, editor of Commonweal and co-host of the Know Your Enemy podcast. Please join me in welcoming Brandon and Matthew to the stage.
Give it up.
Hi, everybody. I have done many events at Center for Fiction, but never for my own book, so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here with my buddy, Matt Sitman.
And neighbor.
And neighbor, I have a gift for you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, open it in front of everybody so they can see.
Oh, wow. I wondered, he texted me earlier today what my favorite color was. So
It's a lamy.
Thank you.
It's a lamy with a left-handed nib.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, grazie mille.
Of course. Thrilled to be here. I'm going to open with a short reading from the novel. It's when earlier Matt was like, what are you going to read? And I was like, well, not the beginning, because I've just come home from book tour and I'm sick of reading the opening of the book already, which, I mean, a thing happens when you do 6 cities in 6 days, or you just get really, you don't know up from down and you're sick of your own words. So I'm going to read from a part of the book I've never read from. So the novel is about a painter named Wyeth who finds himself in New York in the midst of a really bad artist block. And the solution that his friends / studio mates come up with is for him to go look at art that they know he will hate and that he knows he will hate, because they think, well, it can't get any worse than that. It should be very freeing to look at some ugly stuff. And so here is Wyeth going to a show by a collective of painters called Mango Wave. The Mango Wave show was in a gallery that had once been a penthouse that had once been 2 lofts. The floors were original wood rather than the usual poured concrete, but hadn't been re-leveled and stabilized in the reno. As a result, there were no true right angles in the white maze of narrow halls that comprised the gallery. Even the shadows seemed dizzy. Hostile geometry, Wyeth thought. Frankly, it was the worst place in New York to hang a show. People didn't really come for the art. They came for the free wine, for the rooftop access. They came to pose with Washington Square Park at their backs and the city tinkling around them. They came even in the boiling heat, out of the late dusk and early evening, shirts and summer knits, for the last opening before they all decamped to the Hamptons or upstate or to Paris, London, Berlin, Lyon, Marseille, Madrid, Ibiza. What better way to mark the closing of the New York summer and the opening of summer elsewhere than to have oysters and white wine, soft cheeses from the good cheesemonger, specially procured jamon iberico, sliders made with ahi or wagyu or both if you were so inclined, there being a chef on retainer for the evening. They came also to gossip and to see for themselves if the gallery was really in dire straits, if the owner was really in a throuple with a young Swiss and an older Italian who was not a count. The art was secondary, only a fool would come to see it, but Wyeth was a fool if nothing else. Pour les Intimes comprised 9 paintings, mostly oil and acrylic, in both landscape and portrait. The smallest was a tiny postcard, and the largest was 48 by 60. The subject matter was mundane, life scenes and still lifes of modern objects, everything suffused with an aura of gentle melancholy and playful eroticism. There was, too, a juvenile prurience to the delight with which some of the paintings depicted male genitalia. A flat flat-style aerial view of a tabletop, keys in a shell-shaped dish, a half-peeled orange, a smoldering joint, a phone displaying a series of notifications, including one from what looked suspiciously like a gay dating app. Here were messages, codes, mores to decipher if you were feeling interpretive. For example, you could ask what it said about the person to whom the phone belonged, that the phone was a newer model smartphone, and also that the particular gay app in question deployed push notifications only for its premium accounts. The table and the painting retailed for more than $8,000, which you could know only if you had been to the apartment of a certain gallerist who made passes at attractive black men and threw large parties at which he spent quite a lot of time telling people how much that table had cost. What to make of the fact that you knew it was that particular table only because you also recognized below the rug rendered in softest eggshell and the light falling from the right across the field of the painting. If you had been in the room, you knew that table. What did it say about the viewer of the painting that they knew the table? Were they implicated? Was one to believe that the implied narrator of the painting belonged to this cadre of attractive young men who had been cruised into submission by the wealthy gallerist? Was that the particular and unique subjectivity at work, or was it just bragging? The largest painting showed a party scene done in shades of light purple and soft gray, nocturnal though not dark. The scene also took place in the apartment of the wealthy handsy gallerist, but in a different lower room. The party scene had a spangled quality. Light shivered and slid across the field, matching the sense of reverie among the figures with their dark hair and soft limbs, the glow of their phones lighting up their faces, which were distinct yet dreamy, hard to fully see. The painting in its specificity of emotion but vagueness of lineation reminded Wyeth of the writing of a popular Irish novelist he enjoyed. Once you came through her novels, what you remembered were not the names or the plights of the characters, but how they felt about each other. The title of the show, Wyeth realized, and also its governing subtext, was that each of the paintings represented something that might have been posted to close friends on social media. That is, something that was shared publicly but displayed to a curated list, a specialized and smaller public. You posted to close friends because sometimes you went to a party and wanted other people to know you had been to the party but didn't want to deal with the judgment that came from everyone knowing where you had access. So you told a few people, liaison team, but these were not your most intimate friends, not your closest friends, just the people you felt you could brag to without ending up in the guillotine. The people who would also gossip about what they had seen you do in a socially advantageous way. Wyeth had, of course, participated in this trope, taking pictures of himself at the gym or after a run, mugging for the camera to show that he was aloof, strong, or else taking a covert snap of himself in a very particular mirror in a very particular restaurant bathroom downtown and posting it to his close circle so that the people in it would know where he had been because they had also been there or seen it on other circles so that they could adjust his social capital appropriately. It was all signifying. The artists of Mango Wave were geniuses at turning the game of social capital into painting. They were simply doing it with brown people and calling it radical. I'll stop there.
Well, as you can see, sorry to reference our texting habits, but if you haven't read Minor Black Figures yet, the prose is gorgeous and often very funny. Often for me, because I can imagine you saying it, like pointing out the gay app that it was the premium profiles. That I can almost imagine you Riley, mentioning that over a beer or something. And I'm glad you chose that particular selection because it kind of identifies one of the major kind of themes or topics of the book, art. But two other ones, my two favorites, frankly, are religion and sex. Right? Those are also major elements of the book. Probably they'll be the topics that occupy much of this conversation. But in particular, one of the characters, Keating, was a Jesuit priest. He was in formation to be a Jesuit priest. And I thought since this was an ecumenical gathering tonight, I was chosen, by the way, for this conversation for identity politics reasons. I'm a gay Catholic, so I thought, given the ecumenical nature of this gathering, I would tell 2 jokes, or
Yes.
two humorous lines to help you understand what a Jesuit is, as opposed to other kind of species of Catholic. Is that okay?
Please, I love this.
Yes. And the first one came many years ago. I was a first-year PhD student at Georgetown University, where many Jesuits are, right? And I wasn't Catholic yet. I'm an adult convert, so,
But not one of the right-wing ones. It's
Yeah.
important to
I'm the world's only, lived Catholic convert ever.
For now.
Yes. So I arrive at Georgetown Protestant, and I, immediately meet smart Catholics who obviously want me to convert. One of them was a theology professor, Father Fields, and they had just built on campus a beautiful new residence for all the Jesuits to live in, because they have vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So, you have to provide them a place to live. But it was quite beautiful. And the first time I met up with Father Fields to kind of talk theology over a gin and tonic, that was another feature of Catholicism that was a draw. Right before we went into the Jesuit residence, he stopped and very theatrically looked at me and goes, "If this is poverty, bring on chastity." I've never forgotten that line. So that's one introduction to the Jesuit, style, Ignatian spirituality, we could say. Another great aspect of the book that I love is how many cigarettes and people smoking are in it, which is a realistic element of the New York literary arts, et cetera,
yeah.
scene. And smoking features into this joke too. There was two friends, a Franciscan, which is another kind of order in the Catholic Church, and a Jesuit who were friends. And one day they were talking to each other, and they were complaining about how, they just couldn't pray for long periods of time without needing a smoke break, right? And they were, complaining about this, wondering what to do. And they said, you know what? We'll go back, ask our superiors, kind of people in charge of their formation, what to do, right? And so the next time the two saw each other, they said, well, what did your superiors say? And the Franciscan, this is so funny to me, when they met again, the Franciscan was downcast, and he said, I asked my superior if I could smoke while I pray, and he said no. Just absolutely devastating. The Jesuit, smiling, said, I asked my superior if I could pray while I smoke. And he said, of course. No matter what you're doing, you should be able to offer a prayer, right? And so those two, I think, get at something really true about the Jesuits.
I'm sorry, that cooked me. That's
I had to do something since you surprised me with the pen.
That's so funny. You're gonna die. Wow. So true to Keating as a character, too. He would absolutely pray while he smoked.
Yes. We're taught pray without ceasing. Sometimes that'll mean while you're smoking. Now, I did want to ask you, the choice to include a character who not just was religious, but specifically had been in formation to be a Catholic priest. And that means there are beautiful passages. I'll read one in a little bit to all of you. Using religious language, talking about religious concepts like grace, or the Odyssey problem, like an all-powerful and all-loving God, and how does that relate to human suffering? Did you make that choice with any trepidation or sense of doing that now?
Yeah.
Right. Especially in a gay novel, too.
Yeah. Well, I had the great example of Evelyn Waugh, who loves sort of mixing up Catholicism and gay stuff. Brideshead Revisited is one of the great gay excursion novels. When I started this book, I started it. I do what I always do when I start a book, which is I make a list of things I want to write. Which is a very silly and venal way to start a novel, but it has served me in good stead. And I knew that the first thing that I wanted was to have a painter because writing a painter would let me describe a bunch of stuff, and I'd written 2 manuscripts that were very severe. They were about a guy who worked in a deli, and I didn't get to describe a lot of paintings writing about a guy who worked in a deli. So I was
Sandwich artist.
I know. I mean, I lavished description on those sandwiches, and it was not sufficient. And so I was like, I really want to describe light on a wall, and I need an excuse to do that. So I'm going to write a painter. And then the second thing I wanted to do is I wanted to write about a priest, and specifically about a Jesuit, because I wanted to have not an excuse, maybe an excuse, but a way to smuggle in a lot of, I don't know, a lot of writing about faith and about God into the book. I don't know, I think because it does feel like a sort of passé or outre topic in fiction now, I felt really drawn to it. I wanted to sort of confront it directly, and I thought, well, if I write a character who's sort of banally religious or whatever, I'll have all these reasons not to write about that aspect of his life, but there's really no avoiding it with a priest. If you stick a priest in the book, it's kind of like Chekhov's theology, you need to put it, it's got to come in some way. And so I think because it did feel kind of out of step with the time, I felt very drawn to it, and I wanted to explore it in my writing, and I felt like I never had directly. And so it seemed the most expedient way to take up those themes.
Yeah, and to be clear, this former Jesuit seminarian, Keating, is gay, and so
super gay. Yeah.
yeah. We encounter him, in that context. By the way, is the bar where Wyeth and Keating meet? Was it based on Julius?
Yeah,
I thought so. You said the good
cheeseburgers.
And I was like, I know that gay bar.
Yes.
Also, the kind of lackadaisical card checker guy.
Oh yeah.
And I guess, one interesting thing is when 2 gay guys meet, often it's tell me, you share stories, kind of at least some version of your story pretty early in knowing someone, when you came out or when you knew or how horrible your parents were, whatever it might be, right? And in telling that story, as you were getting at, for Keating, you can't, he does avoid it for a while, what do you do for work? A little of this, a little of that. He's kind of a handyman-ish in his building. So you can't, but eventually you had to get there, right? He had to say, this is really my context, my background, my story. And so it's really, faith and God and religion are topics, themes, things you take up, but it's also a lack of faith. Someone who was no longer sure what their relationship to God was, someone who had been so sure at some point that they were going to dedicate their entire life to serving him as a celibate priest in the Catholic Church, as a Jesuit. And so, I asked you first about writing about faith. What was it like writing about a lack of faith? Or, characters who were so ambivalent? Because Wyeth, the artist, he grew up in his uncle, right?
His grandpa.
His grandpa was what do you call it, a lay preacher?
A lay preacher, yeah.
Yeah, so both
sort
of these...
of Pentecostal flavored, I think, is what Wyeth says.
Yeah, so both of these 2 guys who end up hooking up, have these religious pasts in different ways, but they're both very uncertain about it. So tell us about that maybe a little more.
Well, I mean, I think this question of, I think like Wyeth, I moved through the world kind of assuming a sort of rote secularity or a sort of rote kind of a religiosity. And I don't know, I was actually talking to Zadie Smith about this, and she said, it's so crazy that writers think that everyone's an atheist, but most people in America believe in God. And writers are just not taking that up. And I was like, that is so strange. It is true that almost everyone I know from home still believes very devoutly in God, to the point where they think that he can control the weather, and does in fact control the weather, and sends hurricanes to punish for bad thoughts. Right. And everyone I know since leaving home considers that crazy woo-woo ooga booga stuff. And so, I think for me, the challenge was to write about a lack of faith or a lack of religion in a way that was almost encountering it fresh and encountering it new and sort of not taking it for granted. And so exploring what a lack of faith means in America in today's terms, and to sort of recast it. Because I think a lot of people sort of shrug at the idea of losing your faith. It's well, welcome to rationality, friend.
You grew up.
You grew up,
you
right?
Went to college.
And so I thought, well, that's sort of a way of not taking faith and not taking religion seriously, is to sort of shrug and be oh, well, you've grown up, you sort of moved beyond it. And so I thought with this book, I wanted to say well, what happens if you really do care about God and you lose your faith. What is that like? And for Wyeth, he has his own crisis of faith, and it isn't necessarily God related. It's that he's lost faith in his calling as an artist, the thing to which he was devoting himself. And so both of these men, these two characters, are at crisis points in their lives with respect to their vocational calling. And so what does that look like, both in secular terms and in spiritual terms? And for both of these people, the loss feels total, it's sort of total, irrevocably altered their trajectory in life. And I don't know, and so it was fun to kind of take God seriously again in a way that I felt like I hadn't since I was very young.
I think that's a wise course.
Well, usually, yeah.
I want to talk more about Wyeth in just a second, but since we're starting here with religion, one of the things that I was really interested in is because I should say, part of the setting for this, it's the basically current, right? The very recent past, so the pandemic, COVID is a part of it, the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests are a part of it. That's a part of, and it's in New York City. So the protests and kind of churn both the way, the pandemic was so, we couldn't avoid, it wasn't like living in a farm in rural, someplace out. Those things, both the protests and the pandemic, we're confronted with in a very specific way, and they're a very important and interesting part of the book. So there's that kind of broadly political, things hovering over the novel, politics. You don't avoid it. And one of the really interesting things that follows from that is Wyeth being kind of nervous about talking about, say, abortion with Keating because he had been a Catholic priest, and so he assumes he's, anti-choice, anti-abortion, so on and so forth. And I kind of wondered if, the assumption was that Keating would have believed that because he was Catholic. And I wondered if, you would have written about, say, if Wyeth had been sleeping with a libertarian tech bro or finance guy, right? Who, someone who he had other disagreements with that could have been profound, but they were not driven by, religious faith or the assumption of religious faith. And so I wondered if that was a clue to what you thought religion was, some, the elemental nature of it, that a belief driven by that would have, worried this character more than beliefs driven by other kinds of beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, now I'm cracking up about the version of this book where he is sleeping with a libertarian tech bro, and that's so bleak. Oh my God. I guess it'd be sort of Custom of the Country, but about a gay dude, maybe. Undine Spragg goes through a slew of libertarian tech bros in Custom of the Country. I mean, I do think, in part because to be a tech bro is not a sort of deeply spiritual vocational calling, right? And there's something about that I know of.
It's not the Lord's work.
They're not, though they may feel that they are the clerics of our time, I feel differently. And I do think that there's something sort of elemental about it because it wasn't just a sort of political stance. It was a political stance. It was also a moral stance. It was also sort of coming from this fundamental thing in Keating's life, his devotion to God, right? And so I do think that the book bends those things into different categories in the way that I guess I do in my own life. I would feel very differently about someone's convictions if they were religious as opposed to merely Ayn Rand told me that I'm not allowed to do this. But I also think I think not to get all sort of socialism-y about it, but I think Althusser in ideology and the ideological state apparatuses, he also bends these things into different categories of ideological apparatus. It's the sort of political and then the religious and then educational and all this other stuff. And so I do think that those things belong to different categories. And maybe if I were a more enlightened person, I would find a way to sort of put them on equal playing field. But having grown up in a very religious household in Alabama, I'm oh no, God always wins. We used
because God says so.
Well, we used to
counter that.
Well, there isn't one. And when I was little, we used to play rock paper scissors and be rock paper scissors, and then someone would say God's power, and it would beat. And so we would always be rock, paper, scissors, and then like when it was like 2-2 and we needed the tiebreaker, someone would always pull out God's power, and they'd do like this, God's power, and we would. It would
You just accepted that though, as you know.
What amazes me is how thoroughly we all accepted that as like it's like when no one said like, oh, God's power is an option. We were like, oh, of course God wins everything.
Well, last bit about God for a bit. I did want to read just one paragraph from the first half of the novel. It's page 143 about grace. And I love this so much. And we're going to talk about Wyeth a little more, but this involves both Wyeth and Keating. And I'll just read this and then we can move on. But this is very beautiful, I thought. Wyeth understood then and how and why Keating would have made a good preacher, or at least someone good at spiritual instruction. It hadn't been a big, scary theological explanation. This is about the nature of grace. Filled with quotes and page numbers and verses. He knew what it was like to be in a fight, to want someone on your side, to hear you out, to usher you to your higher, better self. It made grace a thing he could get his mind around. The quality of loving someone so much that you did not privilege being right or correct, or hearing them out and holding their hand, and that in loving them sufficiently, you could help them through into understanding themselves and their situation a little better. Viewed that way, it was breathtaking. The idea of grace, caring that much. Beautiful, my friend.
Oh, thank you,
Really.
Matt. Thank you. Now, I mean, you asked this question earlier about did I feel trepidation? I will say that I didn't feel trepidation about like picking up the topic, but I did feel a lot of trepidation like writing it because I was like, I want to do right by the Catholics. Like,
That is so true about Brandon. He's obsessed with Catholicism.
yes, I love them, but also like, you know, like when writing about it, I wanted to take it very seriously, and it involved sort of doing a lot of reading a lot of Karl Rahner, and reading a lot of theology, and also like coming to understand like what are the sort of Orthodox Catholic takes on this, and then how might a person explain this to someone who isn't a believer, right? And to sort of, you know, and it's like really hard for me because typically my characters are really severe and strict and mean to each other. So it was a bit of an exercise writing this like kind man being like generous and patient with another person. I was like, what is this? I don't like this.
Yeah, that was a real stretch, right? You know, that's so interesting because one of the things I wanted to ask you about was Wyeth, the painter. You know, it was so interesting to me that you chose a painter, right, an artist in that sense, to write about because I wondered how much research you did, speaking of the research you did to understand kind of Catholic theology, because your attention to detail, because Wyeth, to make money, kind of support himself, while he's trying to work on his projects, works at a restoration. How would you describe it? It's your novel.
Yeah, no, you're doing a great job. Yeah, so Wyeth, like all the great artists in New York, has 2 jobs where he works part-time in a gallery, and his other job is that he works for an art restorer doing various restoration tasks for them in hopes to sort of moving up to the big leagues and finally getting his own job. And so when we encounter him at the start of the novel, he's doing a lot of what they call scut work. So he's like cutting keys and making sure all the supplies are there and all this other stuff. And then sort of shortly, about 80 or so pages into the book, he gets a summer project, which is to restore these, what are called drawings, but they're really lithographs of this lost black artist, Del Woods. And so he's tasked with restoring it and also researching who Del Woods was. And so he undertakes the restoration process. And I will say, like, that was so much fun to write about. I
could tell you were leading into it.
Oh yeah, I mean,
is Del Woods a real person?
No, I made him up. I love making up people. Okay, one of my favorite genres of books is like.
Good thing you're a novelist.
I know. One of my favorite genres of book is like a book that's got like a fake artist in it. Like when the author just sort of gets to write fake fiction in the voice of another character, or they get to describe paintings that don't exist. And so I had a lot of fun thinking of like, what if a black painter had made lithographs like Helen Frankenthaler in her sort of in her lithograph period. Wouldn't that be cool? What would that look like? And I went looking for one that had, and I couldn't find any. And then I was like, that won't stop me. I'm just gonna make one up and then make him go missing. And so, Wyeth gets these, I think it's like 8 or 9 lithographs that he's got to restore, and they're in various states of disrepair. And it was a lot of fun sort of researching how paper gets restored, because like paintings I get, like, okay, like canvas is like pretty, like it's pretty sturdy, but I'm like, paper, like what if they're sort of working on, like how do they clean paper, right? And there are all these like different strategies, all these different modes of restoration. And so really the challenge was like figuring out how much of that I could get away with smuggling into the book without getting in trouble with my editor. And I'm like, well, I've got to put in the graded eraser. Everybody wants to read about a guy rubbing eraser into and then I got to do the baths too. Like that's fun, right? People love people dipping things into various liquids. And so it was fun. It was fun to do. And then also I'm like, I get to like put in, my other favorite kind of narrative is paperwork movies. And so I just love it when a character is like walking a place with documents and researching things. And so I'm like, oh, and then I get to put in all this stuff about how to like email the New York Public Library. And then he's like going through a spreadsheet. No, I don't want to give too much away. There's a spreadsheet, guys. And that part was so much fun, but it did involve a lot of like going to the Strand and buying all their sort of like art books and their sort of old art books. I bought this huge book it's called the Tamarind Book of Lithography, because the Tamarind, like on Tamarind Street, I think in LA, or maybe it was New Mexico or something, they like started an Institute for American Lithography. And I bought their big reference book on it, and it had everything in it. And I learned about lino and like engraving and all this really amazing stuff that I didn't get to put in a book, and hopefully I will have to write another one where I'll get to write about metal engraving.
Yes. Well, in addition to the research you did for Wyeth, which again I found so fascinating, it's really like a pleasure to read. I also wondered, like, you're a writer. Are you a painter too?
No. No.
I didn't think so. Do you dabble in photography, maybe?
I do.
Okay.
Now we're we're playing 20 questions.
What's going to come next? But the thing I really was interested in was the choice of making Wyeth an artist, a painter, and not a writer, and how much you were able to kind of riff on, write about, think through the creative process in that different mode.
Yeah.
And I think it's especially interesting to me where some of the kind of dynamics around him being a black painter and the perception of black art in this space you're describing in New York City, this kind of elite Soho gallery kind of space. And there was one line in particular I wanted to read because it's about a painter, but I kind of wondered if you felt this applied to you as a writer too. And it is when Wyeth is talking to Chloe, and this is the line. Every black painter had 2 careers, a career among their black contemporaries and a career among their white contemporaries. As much as he hated that logic, after all, some black painters weren't famous because they were bad painters, but it did have, at bottom, a sense of truth. And I just wondered, again, you're a writer, but this painter, it seemed like, it was very interesting to me to kind of follow along as this painter kind of worked through, especially the dynamics I said around race in his art, and especially in that moment. But say more about that if you want.
You're gonna get in trouble. I'm gonna get canceled.
That was my goal coming.
I knew it. So. I felt it. It's all my Catholic slander. But I think, I think that's. I feel that way. I certainly feel that way. That like, there is how your work is received among, like, received and conceptualized and contextualized among your black peers when you're a black writer or a black artist or a black anything. They talk about you in the context of like how your work fits into various other discourses around black art. And then there is a conversation about your work and how it intersects or sort of integrates into sort of larger artistic discourses about America or whatever, or like the contemporary moment. And I always think like when we discuss like black contemporary art, like there are two conversations happening. There's like the Black contemporary, and then there's the contemporary. And somehow the Black contemporary is never allowed to signify like that outer, larger conversation. Like it's never allowed to sort of stand in for that larger conversation for reasons that are like historical, social, and like having largely to do with racism and all this other stuff. And so, I mean, in part, like Wyeth is a painter because I wanted to like describe a bunch of stuff, but also like he's a painter because it let me have some distance from like a lot of the conversations around my own work and around the conversations around my peers' work. And it let me sort of look at how discourses around Black art function and unfold in other media and in other forms and modes. And what I found is like they're actually kind of the same. like it's amazing how similar those conversations are. And so it's almost like no matter what the medium is, almost regardless of what the art itself is, the conversation is the same. It's almost like we only exist as these.
The dynamics are the same.
The dynamics are the same. Like I could paint a red circle, a blue square, or like an octopus, and people would say the exact same things about the work. Like the work is immaterial to the discourse in a way, and like that to me feels really stupid and kind of evil. So I think in this book I was like trying to figure out like, what is it about those discourses, even the ones that feel progressive, that feel kind of racist to me in how they unfold? Like, what is this sort of like racist logic that cuts on both sides of the street in the way that we talk about Black art, even when in a sort of affirming way that feels like kind of reductive and racist to me? And to sort of add, or not even add nuance, but to sort of just like take the sort of received conversations around race and art and identity and representation and to kind of just like explode them out and sort of see what's actually inside of them. Because I think what people will find is when they sort of start to unpack a lot of those conversations, that at bottom there's a kind of racist essentialist logic to a lot of the way that we talk about art, especially Black art in this country. But that's my take. And do with that what you will.
Yeah. Well, one of the other interesting parts of the novel is I'm always interested in the choices novelists make about how many details about things like social media, phones, contemporary events you include or not. And this is very heavy on those, I would say. But one of the really, I thought, fascinating kind of wrinkles to this Black artist's career was when kind of during the BLM protests, one of his images went viral, right?
Yeah.
And
it was so stupid. Why did I write that? I will say I was cackling as I was writing that.
But that is a real thing that happens, though.
Yeah.
And you get in some great little digs, like, they were paying attention to this Black artist, like now, right? Like in this moment where it was, we all know what was happening on Instagram during the spring of 2020. People you never thought were that woke, the most elaborate, long post,
or the Black
squares. Some ways, but it was, I just kind of wondered, that bit of like viral fame in this fraught moment. It was very fresh and interesting, and I kind of wondered like what you brought to that plot detail.
Yeah, like Wyeth's art is that he takes scenes from European cinema usually, and he just like puts Black people in it. And he's interested in, he's not really interested, he doesn't have like a sort of like aesthetic project beyond that. He's just like, well, I know what Black people look like and I like these tableaux. I'm just gonna like stick Black people in them. And when he was in art school, his Black classmates were like, our people are dying, please stop doing your European fan fiction. And which, fair. And his white classmates were like, why are you putting Black people in these like pristine, beautiful European scenes? And he was just sort of confused about the response because he had a very naive approach to his work. And so one thing that he does is he sort of paints a scene from Bergman and he puts Black people in it, but and then he uploads it, and because of like what's happening on Instagram at that time, people read it as like a commentary on the sort of precarious nature of Black life and the murder of Black men. And he goes mega viral, and then someone offers him a pile of money, and then he says to that guy, this is not a spoiler, it's like in chapter 2, you'll get there, but like he says like, he's like, this is just Bergman. And the guy's like, I know, that's why it's so beautiful. I love that you've done this, right? And it makes Wyeth feel crazy because he's like, I'm just doing the same thing I was doing before. but somehow the sort of surrounding conversation around my work has changed, and that change has now made it so that people want to give me piles of money for doing what essentially I was doing, and they're reading a political project into this when I don't have one. And then he's thinking, like, what if they find out I don't have a political project and I'm revealed to be a fraud? I'm going to get in so much trouble. And then people view his sort of refusal of this projection of a political project as a sort of like attempt to distance himself from it. And so the book tries to understand, well, Wyeth then tries to figure out, like, well, am I anxious about this because I don't want to be over there with all the other Black artists? Or am I anxious about this for my own aesthetic reasons? Am I allowed to have my own aesthetic reasons as a Black artist in America? Or am I always sort of, am I always sort of part of a sort of larger cultural conversation? Do I ever get to just be a painter?
Yes.
And
I love that. Those kinds of, you're wrestling with that.
Yeah, I mean, and I have no answer, neither does he. I mean, do we ever get to just be anything, really?
Yeah. I thought the kind of can't win nature of that problem came through, the frustration with that came through very
Yeah,
well.
I loved putting him in the the vice, just like turning the crank as he
Yes. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll probably go to audience questions. But I did promise some discussion of sex.
Let's do it.
And before I even read Brandon, a good friend of mine who I would say I trust his judgment in the area of good sex writing said, I think the best novelist writing these days about sex is Brandon Taylor.
Oh.
And I will say, I'm not going to read it. I don't want to blush, but I affirm that judgment. But I do think, writing about sex, like writing about religion, is difficult to do it well. I mean, there's the annual horrible sex writing prize they give. I was thinking of some examples of writers, how they handle it. Walker Percy, I know you're currently teaching the moviegoer in the class you're teaching. He just skips over it. He just says he held her charms in his arms, right? It's like this, totally, toothless, banal, bland reference. Or I once asked a gay novelist, Christopher Bram, how he handled it. Because he and I used to do coffee when I first moved to the city, and I asked this of every novelist, how do you write about sex? He said, it's so difficult. He said, often I just kind of skip to when it's over and have the guy smoking a cigarette in bed. But you nail it.
Aw.
And I kind of wonder if there's any principles of good writing about sex in novels, because it's a question that fascinates me.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
I figured the crowd wouldn't mind,
Talking about
yeah.
sex. There's so much sex in this book, but there's less than my previous books. I really tried to tone it down. Yeah, I mean, the first books I read were romance novels, and I taught myself to read using my aunt's romance novels, and so that was sort of the core of my literary formation as a young reader, 5 years old, reading romance novels, and the Winn-Dixie, Linda Lyle Miller, and
This is amazing lore, by the way. I didn't know this about you. So
I was reading books I should not have been reading, and I do think that romance novelists are better at this than anyone. They understand the power of sex, the humor of sex, the absurdity of sex, the sort of banality of sex, the sort of rote physicality of it. And so I take all my lessons from them. I never knew that writing sex was hard because I'd always been reading romance novelists. And so when I write sex, I try to think a lot about what does the character want? What do they want sexually? What do they want to get out of it? Because I think a lot of people forget that that people want things sexually. And they're just they're gonna bump, they're bumping Ken dolls together. And I'm no. This guy wants to be stepped on. This guy wants it this way, And so I just try to think about what the character wants, and then to, anything, I'm writing a conversation, right? Two people negotiating a physical exchange, and I try to keep my language really direct and frank. I try to keep it focalized through a character and to sort of be attentive to the body and to pleasure and to what it feels like, and to sort of make the body totally legible in the way that it often is when you're having sex with somebody. Allegedly, I wouldn't know. I'm very pure. But I think my main guiding principle is that I just try never to be precious. I try never to be coy or clever or sly, and to sort of present it, honestly and frankly, because I find that's the hottest thing in the world, is when it's just frank and direct. That's the best kind of language around sex, I find.
That's not a bad note to end on before we take your questions.
Yeah. Questions, thoughts, comments, anxieties. Yes. The interns are coming.
Well, first of all, I'm a gay Catholic scientist, so I'm having the time of my life. And my girlfriend loves Undine Sprague, so she's having the time of her life.
Let's go!
But I have a question for you, that sly little reference to a popular Irish writer. I know that you're someone who loves the classics and, reference Undine Sprague on the regular and things like that, but also you have these little digs that are fun for this generation of readers. So I'm interested in your perspective as the writer. How do you balance like longevity in fiction, spanning social milieu for many years, but also writing something that feels fun for right now?
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, I am president of the Rooney Tunes. I love Sally Rooney. I just felt, I would have used her name, but I just felt like if I'd put her in the book, that would have been the only thing people talked about when they reviewed it. But I love her, love Sally Rooney. She's such a queen. And, now I'm thinking about Sally Rooney, I love her too much. But, my students ask this all the time as well, where like when I show them a piece of writing from like 30 years ago and it has references in it, they're like, I didn't know you could reference stuff. But what about dating your work? And I was like, friend, you're lucky if 8 people are gonna read that today. You're thinking about 50 years from now. I think specificity is key, and I think it's best. Lionel Trilling said in, I think it was Morality Manners in the Novel, where
You're speaking my love language.
Oh, I know. Where Lionel Trilling sort of basically says that like manners are what we call the sort of hum and buzz of implication, and that often when we read something from another time or another place, we can't access it, and like all the details feel like spiky, like bright points because they stand out to us, but like to a reader of that time, it wouldn't stand out at all. And so I think it's about filling your work with enough local texture that it feels of a piece with its time. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of writing stuff that feels contemporary. I find a lot of pleasure in that. And so I always encourage people, like, just put the reference in. Like, put it in, like, put it in. Don't be afraid of dating your work, because like dating it, I mean, by trying to attain a sort of false universality, you end up writing something incredibly vague that people are gonna forget in 2 days anyway, right? So put the reference in, I say. And have fun, that's important too. Write for the giggle. I giggle a lot when I'm writing. Other questions?
Hello. You mentioned earlier you are fond of books about fictional artists, and I was wondering if you had any in particular that you would recommend.
Oh, friends, welcome. I mean, this is sort of a cheat, but I love it. But To the Lighthouse is wonderful. There's a wonderful painter in there, and I love all this stuff about the painting. I think Lan Samantha Chang has a wonderful book called All Is Forgotten, Nothing Is Lost, I think is what it's called, and it's about poets. And it's so beautiful, and to me it is like the best book about a writer. Like, it's so exquisite, and it's so, so good. One of my favorite instances of this is Anne Patchett's Commonwealth. That is a book that is not really about like an artist until like you get to like the title drop of the book, and then it becomes a book about a book that is like so dishy and so delicious, and it's so good, and I really love it. And this is about like not a fake artist but a very real artist. But Caitlin Horrocks has a book called The Vexations that's about Satie, and it's astonishing and really amazing, and I recommend it. And so those are some of my favorites about like artists. And I could read them all day. Also, Idra Novi's last novel, I forget the title. It's vanishing on me, but it's about an installation artist, and it's so good. And there are a lot of power tools in it and scrap metal, which I really, the materiality of it is so astonishing.
I have one to add. Just a few years ago, it was translated from the French. It's a real artist, David Hockney. I think it's just called The Life of David Hockney, but it's like a novelized biography of him. And I really loved it. So,
you heard it here. Wait, isn't that the one with like the yellow cover with the glasses, I think?
Yes, that is the cover.
That's a good book. Yes, back there, maybe there's a hand.
Your first 2 novels were set in a college campus, and I haven't read this one yet because I just bought it today. And I was wondering about this, I'm assuming is set in New York City, and was that freeing? What were the challenges? Like, I just want to know what you think about setting.
Yeah. You know, I'm very much like a creature, weirdly, I'm from the South, but I lived in the Midwest for like 10 years, and I became like a creature of the Midwestern campus. And that was like where my imagination was. And then I was meant to write a book called Group Show that was about a Midwestern art museum. And I tried for many years to write that book, and I kept writing 137 pages and throwing them away for like 5 years. I even got a fellowship to work on it. And it was set in the Midwest, and I just like couldn't write it because I wasn't living there anymore. And I felt so divorced from the on-the-ground rhythms and concerns of life there. And then I threw it out and decided to write this book, and I decided, okay, like enough trying to sort of recapture the Midwest. I live in New York now, let's just sort of start with a thing you know and can write. And so I decided to set this book in New York, and almost from the word one, you know, it just like flew by. So, you know, it's set in New York, but then I felt a lot of anxiety because like New Yorkers are very protective of their city, and like no one will fact check you like a New Yorker, like that street does not touch that street, and like actually it takes so long to get from here to here, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, man, I'm so, how many streets per page do I name? Gotta get the, you know. At a certain point, my editor was like, Brennan, you have quite enough of the subway in here. And I was like, do I? New Yorkers love the subway, do I? And so I don't know, like I found it really freeing, actually. I found it really freeing to sort of begin writing about the fiction, and I felt like I had truly entered into this phase of my life when my fiction also moved to this place. And now when I try to write about the Midwest, it feels like, who was that? Like, what was that? I don't even know how they talk there anymore. And so maybe I'm just like a serial monogamist for regions. I don't know. Who knows if actually now I'm writing a fiction set in France, so like it's a bit, you know, I'm so slutty. I just like dump one region for the other. There's some hands up here.
Hi, thanks again. Also a big fan of your podcast as well.
Thank you, sir.
So
It's a great pod.
It's a great podcast. But I'm also a big fan of your work, Brandon. And I guess something I wanted to ask was, I follow your social media accounts, and you frequently post about reading works of literary criticism, art criticism, and it feels like it's a strain in your previous work as well as probably, and I guess, your current work. But I think this kind of relates back to the question about the artistic process. What role do you feel like is the author of the novel as critic? And what things troubled you about that in this process of writing this novel?
That's a great question. I think of this as the book that criticism built. In 2021, I started reading a lot of literary criticism. I started reading Trilling and Kazan and Fiedler and all these other guys like Guy Davenport. And then I sort of fell down a rabbit hole with Georg Lukács and Frederick Jameson and other great thinkers and critics. And they gave me a language for some of the dissatisfactions I had with the novel as a form, or like my understanding of the novel as a form, and they gave me a way to think through like things I wanted to do in my work, but like couldn't figure out like what it was I wanted. I couldn't like name it, but I knew I wanted to do something. And for me, like with this book, I wanted to sort of write a book that could contain the social process and could illustrate the social process, which is like so key in Lukács's criticism, and a book that could sort of have a character whose problems and urgencies were connected deeply to the problems and urgencies of his time, and also like being brave enough to sort of let politics into the novel and to let the sort of political specificity and historical specificity of a time into the book, because so many my other works felt very nebulous with respect to history. They were set in a kind of like gauzy anytime present, and with this book I wanted it to feel like a particular time in a very particular place at a particular moment in the social process. And all of that, I think, came from my reading of criticism. Like, this book wouldn't exist had I not accidentally read all of Georg Lukács's criticism. I wouldn't have written it. And to me, the criticism gives a language often to things that I feel, and it gives me a target to sort of approach. But the danger is that you become too aware of it, and then you write a kind of insidery, know-y, irritating book, which I think some people are guilty of. I will not name names. But it's like when you're dancing with somebody and you just know they're looking at a mirror over your shoulder. And that's the feeling I want to avoid when I'm writing fiction. And like that, having read so much criticism, that was then a thing I had to sort of watch for in my own stuff. But that's a great question.
Time for one more question.
Great. One more. Make it good.
No pressure.
So you're incredibly prolific.
Is that true?
Yes, I mean, my timeline might be wrong, but I think you've published like 4 books in 5 or 6 years, which is really impressive, and it's also really rare. I think like we've gotten really used to writers like taking 5 or 10 years between, you know, their novels, and we've just kind of, that's become the norm. And so I'm fascinated by how prolific you are, and I'm just curious, like, how do you do it? Do you have advice for people who want to be able to produce at that type of pace instead of just torturing over something for years?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, ask yourself if that's a pace you want to pursue, and if so, why? Like, I don't think it's a pace anybody necessarily needs to do. I think ultimately it takes the time it takes, and you should pursue your work in a way that feels gratifying and interesting to you. You shouldn't make yourself work at a breakneck pace just because you think that you should. Like, you don't need to. Nobody needs to write like I write. It's a sickness. Don't do it. But I think for myself, I just like try to get after it. I just try to like, when I get an idea, I just like pursue it doggedly with great intensity. I mean, I also am single. I don't have dogs. I don't have children. Everything about my life is constructed to give me maximum time to pursue writing and my interests, because that is the only thing that brings me joy in life. That and tennis. I guess tennis now is the thing. I'm like building my writing schedule around playing tennis. And so I think, like, you know, some general tips is just like be really firm with yourself. Like, you know, be really firm with yourself and your boundaries. Like, if you're gonna write that day, write that day. You know, be flexible enough to be like, oh, it's not there today. Like, maybe I can do something else that's writing related. Be generous with yourself, but firm. And I think also, like, be organized. Like, a lot of people waste a lot of time sort of chasing loose ends or like dead ends or whatever, which is fine, but like, try to be organized about your thinking and your approach to your work. I always tell my students, make lists of things that you know you can write a lot of words about, so when you get stuck, you just pick something from the list and go after it. And just like try to, you know, build a process that lets you write, you know, and whatever that process looks like for you. And I think trying to find out what works for you is always a good use of time. I used to be like, you need to write 200 words a day. And then I was like, okay, I did that. That took 2 minutes. What do I do? What do I do with the rest of the day? And then I realized, like, oh, that writer was writing 200 words a day because 1, they were typing on a manual typewriter, and 2, they didn't grow up with the internet. And so I was like, okay, for me, that 200 words a day is really, when I was writing this book, it was like sometimes 8,000 words a day, sometimes it was 4,000 words a day, sometimes it was 2,000 words a day. But like figuring out like what your own rhythm is, I think that really starts to unlock your inner productivity. Now I sound like a tech bro, but just figure out what works for you and stick to it, and be really firm with yourself about sticking to it. And you'd be surprised how productive you can be. Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Matt. So much fun.
You are the best.
Thank you all so very much for this conversation. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you all for coming. So we will get Brandon set up right over in the bookstore for a personalization line, and get sort of a line going, so
Great.
you can greet your fans here.
Fans.
Grab a drink at the bar. No need to rush off. Hope you'll stay and continue your conversation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
That was so fun.